Welcome back, everybody, to another exciting episode of our legal series with the phenomenal Bushra Mohammed, who is our resident house solicitor. Now, Bushra, why do solicitors take so long? Oh, it infuriates me. All the social media, the chatter on it is about solicitors taking so long. Now, I used to work for a law firm and I do understand the process from the inside, and I feel the pain of investors, buyers and sellers of it taking so long. Now, I've seen it where solicitors have too big a caseload. Is that the case? Or is it just they're not experienced because the law firms hired some paralegals straight from or trainee paralegals, and they've given them a caseload and they're just inexperienced? Or is it just they're unresponsive? I mean, or is it the client's fault more to the point, or the other side's? So, I mean, I know when we get going, the first thing you have to do is not receive the client instructions going, here's the right move link. Can you just complete now? From your side, you've got to get to know your client. You've got to go through anti-money laundering. So is it the client's fault for delaying sending the passport and stuff? I mean, help me out here, Bushra. Help the audience understand this.
Excellent question, Andrew. So I'm so sick and tired of people complaining on social media, especially on Instagram right now. Oh, everything's being delayed. My solicitor this, my solicitor that. But having been on both sides of the fence as a buyer and as a solicitor of several property transactions, I can empathize. But at the same time, I understand the complexities that are involved with each transactions. So I want to set the record straight, Andrew, for well, at least for most of my profession.
Well, we're not
getting our hair and nails done every day, and that's why we're not responding to you. Because believe it or not, no, Andrew, no. I mean, I might look like I get my hair and nails done every day, but I don't. So no two transactions are the same. So you might say, okay, there's 100 leases, they're identical, but the buyers are not identical. Their circumstances are not identical. Having worked on several off-plan developments in the past, you would think acting for 100 buyers on the same block of a new development flats where the lease has been drafted identically, it'd be straightforward, but it's not the case. So each buyer circumstances are different. From I have to check all the AML checks, the anti-money laundering checks, which means their ID, their sources of funds, and then making sure that those are certified. Also, when they're buying in a company name, I've got to make sure that actually I've got all the company checks done, they're knowing that who those directors are. And some of these company structures, as you know, are quite complicated to find out who is actually the beneficiary. And then it might take 2 solicitors to just double check that we've covered our liability to understand who is our client, because as solicitors, we have a huge responsibility to make sure we are protected in anti-money laundering issues. So there's a lot of things that you need to check just on your phone call of a client to say, okay, can you act for me? And that can, take weeks, because we have to wait for the client to actually provide us with all those documents. And if they're not, in these current circumstances, going to send us certified documents, we would expect them to come to our office, and we would meet them and certify it. But obviously we can't right now. But all these little nuances do take time to be able to just fulfill at the first step, the first hurdle.
So a top tip here for the audience is make sure, if you're going to appoint your solicitor, to know the requirements of the anti-money laundering, the proof of identity, proof of address, proof of source of funding, to help you with the know your client file, and have all of that information ready so that you can mitigate or reduce any delay on your side getting the transaction going. Would that be a fair point?
exactly, that you'd save weeks, you know, and or even it might be just as much as days, because no matter how urgent your transaction is, those few days will add up, and then it will just speed things up, and it might give you the extra time near the end when you need it to do something a bit more faster as well. And once you've got those things done, then we can, whether you're usually a buyer in the buyer, so I'm going to be talking as a buyer's perspective. As a buyer's solicitor, I would then make contact with the seller solicitor. So in those circumstances, I will say that I'm acting for X, buying block, flat, development, such and such in this area. And then once they receive that correspondence, then they will have to do exactly what we've just done, the AML, with their clients as the seller solicitor. So that might take time for them to confirm actually they are acting for that seller before they even correspond with me.
So assuming that, as another tip is obviously check that the seller has actually appointed their solicitor and gone through all the AML and KYC with their solicitor.
Mm-hmm.
But assuming they've done that, do they just send the contract over and you just look at it and go, yeah, sign on the dotted? I mean, is that how it works?
I wish it was that simple, Andrew. So obviously, as a seller,
simple.
The seller solicitor will have to be, once they instructed from their client, they will take instructions on what it is exactly that they are selling. So they will apply for the office copies as well. They will get plans. Then if there is a lease to be drafted, they may have to draft a brand new lease. Or if there's already a lease in place, they'll easily get a copy from their client, send that on. Then the crux is they have to agree all the terms and put them in a contract. So if you've agreed any terms with the estate agent, in your estate agent's memorandum, it'll be included in the contract as well. So depending on whether it's a bigger development or a small scale purchase of a house or a flat, all those terms that you've agreed in your heads of terms will be incorporated in the contract. So the solicitor's got to draft that contract. If there's any restrictive covenants in that office copy, they've got to be repeated in the contract as well. The price, the title number, the purchasers. So they've got to make sure that the names are exactly the same as on the contract, because then we'll have to go back and forth amending it. So once all those details have been agreed with their client, they will then send it to me, and any other affiliated documents, for example, the seller's information form, the property information form, and any leasehold information form, the managing agent's information, service charge on those kind of transactions. So whilst they're getting all those documents ready in the background, which can take weeks, if not more, on my behalf as a buyer solicitor, once I've got monies on account and I've been formally instructed and I've got a retainer, then I'll confirm with my client, okay, I'm going to now apply for searches. So I'll get the local authority search, the water and drainage search, environmental, and then sometimes you might want to get a chancel or a cold search depending on where the locality is. But most of these searches might take a week, but the local authority, as you're aware, can take several weeks. So that can delay things as well.
A top tip at this point is when you're communicating with the agent, if your name is Thomas, don't put down that it's Tom that's buying it, because it needs to be in the legal name.
Correct.
And all of the details need to match. Similarly, with all of your evidence you provide need to match. And then it becomes a little more complicated if you decide to bring in a lender. Because if you're buying cash, it's great. I can advise you what to do. But if you're acting for a lender, providing mortgage finance, there's a little bit of a complexity here, isn't there? Because you're actually acting for the lender opposed to the client, and you have to follow the lender's instructions because it's their money.
True.
Now, does that cause delays or problems? Because surely, the valuer just nips out, does his valuation, pings an email over and says, hey up, it's worth that much money. I mean, is that right?
So once your valuer has sent over their valuation report to you, they will be sending it over to the mortgage lender. Now, what some clients often forget is that we have a legal obligation when we're acting for the lender. So we've got a legal responsibility to act in the lender's interest, because at the end of the day, they are lending you the money and we are also acting for you, but we're acting for your bank, your building society, whichever lender it might be if we're on their panel. So we are going to be communicating with the lender on a checklist of points to ensure that their interest, has been also covered. So they will want to know all the searches have been done correctly and their interest is covered on that point. They will want to know that you've looked at the title and any points that might come up on the title, you're satisfied with it, because it's our duty, as our responsibility as well as the solicitor, to check that there's nothing onerous that will affect you, but also as well as the lender. So we've got to report everything back to them as well. And that might take time as well, because if there's something a bit onerous on the title, a defect in the title, or something that might come up in the search, we've got to report to them, get their okay on it, and then continue. And that might just take a little bit longer as well, because we've got to cover our kind of professional interest as well, to say, okay, we've acted in the lender's best interest in those circumstances.
So you've raised an interesting point here about acting for a lender, and this is another top tip I share with people. When you're hiring your solicitor, the first thing I always recommend people do is find out what lender they're going to use. The reason they need to find out the lender is not every solicitor is on that lender's panel, because some lenders only have a panel of 4 or 5 solicitors in the whole of the UK. Now, because they've got such a small panel, we've got a good relationship, Bushra, and I love working with you. However, you're not on every lender's panel because you're not on those smaller select panels.
Correct.
Therefore, a top tip is to actually identify your lender and then check that the solicitor's on their panel, because it adds a complexity in that you're acting for the client. You then have to report to the lender's panel solicitor, who reports to the lender. And it adds more complexity into the chain.
It does. No, I always ask my client, firstly, do you know which lender you're going with, or which finance institution you're going with? Because my firm is not on all the panels. So on the few occasions, my clients will be happy to say, look, Bushra, I don't know which one we are going with, but I want you to act for me. And I'm more than happy to pay for a separate solicitor who will act for the lender's interest. That's more than fine. But just be aware that that just adds another kind of entity in the whole, transaction, to say, then I've got to then communicate with this other solicitor to say, okay, can you just confirm with me what the mortgage conditions are, and if you're happy with that, just as I would if I was acting for the lender's solicitor as well. So in those scenarios, it can be a bit more complex. I do advise clients to get a solicitor who can act for both of you. Just makes the transaction that much more smoother.
So it's a really good bit of advice you give there, and it does speed up the transaction. Now, we've been reviewing the title on a property, and it's got an issue. And it could be that the issue is something simple, like it's part of a chancel area where it might have to make a contribution to the church should it make a call to pay money. Now, that can be an issue, but I sort of look at it and go, in the interest of speed, provided any lender is happy, why don't we just use a title defect insurance and insure the problem to fix it? There's certain things where there's missing title deeds, for example. I mean, what a top tip advice would you give to people out there if they encounter this sort of problem,
Yeah.
Bushra? Because there's all sorts, isn't there?
Oh, there's several. I mean, the ones that you mentioned are quite rare, but they're quite
Yeah.
simple in those circumstances, and they can be easily rectified. For example, a chancel search, because some of the buildings or in the villages or some areas are quite old, and it's quite expected almost that you're going to get a positive past chancel search, and it's going to say, well, you are going to be possibly liable to the parish if they call upon everybody in the town. But that can be easily covered for a nominal amount. Your solicitor will get the indemnity insurance in place, provide you with a certificate, report back to the lender, and you'll be fine. Some things will be a little bit more complicated, and the solicitor might have to spend a little bit more time investigating it and go back and forth to the seller solicitor to make more inquiries. So even though we would have all the information given to us by the seller solicitors, at that time, we will also have received our searches results, as well as combined with the seller's documents. We have to review the whole thing and create a whole picture basically for our client. And at that time, that can take a good portion of your day to go through all the documents and draft a title report. And whilst I'm doing that, I'm also making notes of queries that I'm going to raise with the other side solicitors. So I'm going to be saying, okay, there seems to be some sort of discrepancy in this document, in the title, and in your property information form about the boundaries. That's just one example, because you want to know, for example, which boundary is your responsibility, but the property information form might just say something like, we believe it's on the left, but the title document says it's on the right. Something simple as that. We'll have to go back to the other side, clarify it, and then at that time, they have to clarify it with their client. So it might be something that we might not get to the bottom of, but you've got to then just decide on something simple as that, what your position is. Other things might be on water and drainage, for example, what the position is with the meter, whether it's connected. And I've had so many instances where the person filling out these property information forms might not be the person who actually owned the property, but is the representative of the property. And those are the instances where there's the most discrepancy, because it's so frustrating for my client buying it, because I've had to raise so many requisitions and assume that this person clearly has no idea, because it doesn't make any sense. In one form, they'll say one thing and completely contradict on the other form. But in my client's interest, I've got to make sure I've covered my back as well as the client's interest to say, well, what's going on here? Please make sure your client understands whether it means this or this. So that's just one example of where things can get delayed and get quite confusing and frustrating, not just for me, but for the client as well, because it can just add those weeks up.
Yeah. Well, we did a video recently on auction legal packs and how to review an auction legal pack. Now, when you're buying from auction, it's a much faster process, because the seller basically produces a contract pack and you're buying what's there. Could we change the legal process to do that? And this is a curveball question that you had no idea was coming. But would it be beneficial to actually do this? Because I remember back in the 90s, we had home buyer information packs aimed at speeding up the process, but it didn't really work.
No, I actually remember those times as well, because I was in training. So it feels like a long time ago, but I do remember it. So I don't think it actually sped anything up, clearly, because people are just still going to be reviewing those documents, and they still can take as long as they want. They still have to apply for their mortgage, which we know can take up to months. No matter which broker you're with, it can be delayed as long as that much, because your broker is going to be trying to get valuations, arranging mortgage, and all these little other things that are happening in the background. Just because you've got a home information pack doesn't mean that, okay, all your problems are solved, because you still need to have all the other moving parts in line to be able to say, okay, we can move forward. You've got to get all your searches done, as well as make sure the chain is in line for your process, as well as if there's a buyer from the seller's list, sorry, if the sellers are also buying, or if you're somebody or you're also selling as well. So in those circumstances, then it doesn't make much difference, and clearly it didn't work in the past.
And that was why it was junked. But I mean, I'm sort of looking at this. There's a top tip here that I'm not sure you realize you've shared, which is that basically you as the buyer or the seller need to project manage all of the different parties in this, which is keeping communication with your solicitor, with your broker, with your lender, with the other party that you're buying from or selling to.
Yep.
You can't communicate with their solicitor because they have a conflict of interest if they start talking with you. So please don't phone up the other side solicitor. It's not a wise bit of advice. But the important thing is, part of it you can actually project manage and chase through. Now, if you stay tuned to this video series that Bushra and I are releasing, you'll learn lots of different things along the way as to how you can make your transactions go smoother. Now, Bushra, chains. And I'm not talking kinky here, I'm talking housing chains.
Okay, thank you. Go for that.
The smaller the chain, the easier the transaction.
Definitely.
Now, I mean, we've all heard about chains breaking. It broke above us, it broke below us, and then it broke above us again, and the whole chain fell apart.
Yeah, so that
Any
puts a lot of
tips on
pressure on the
that?
transaction. So obviously, the best scenario is no chain. So you're not committed, or you're not the person, or your transaction is not reliant to complete the chain, so that you're not selling or buying, sorry. So if I'm acting for the buyer, my client is not also selling and not relying on the sale of their property to be able to buy this. And as well as the seller who's selling to my client is not relying on their sale, to my client to be able to buy their next house. So it can get very confusing, and you've got to almost do a sort of a picture diagram of who's who and where we are in all the stages, because you might have to make contact with somebody up the chain to say, okay, where are we now, and how far are we going to be, and make sure all the dates almost align and everybody's going to be in sync, because it just takes somebody's mortgage offer to lapse, and then that adds another delay because you have to wait for the mortgage offer to be extended. You might have any other personal circumstances that could go array, and you've got to just add another days, weeks again. And you just pray that everybody else is also going to be following your, line of flow.
It sounds to me a little bit like a lunar eclipse or a solar eclipse where all the planets align together in order that we can get this balancing act of tipple-topple houses all trying to fall in together. So, I mean, let's assume we've got the chain and it's all working fine. We've carried out the searches and we didn't find any problems and the contracts were all good. I'll just sign the contract and that's it. We're over the line.
Well, once you've got to that stage, that's brilliant, because almost probably halfway there, if not more. So once you've got
halfway, are you joking? Is this why solicitors take so long, Bushra?
Andrew, be patient. So you've got to make sure your title report has gone to your client and they approve it. You've got to make sure any requisitions about the leasehold inquiries you might have made, about the title, any other amendments on the contract you've made, they've all been approved. Once all those little details have been done, then you can send the contract out to your client. The TR1 or any other FR1 document that you might have for the land registry document has been then signed by your client, plans been approved, signed, and then you've got to wait for your client to understand all of that, because your client might not actually understand some of your title report that you sent to them, and you're then having to do a meeting, a phone call to explain it, and they might come back with more inquiries that you have to go back and forth. But assuming they've got nothing then still to raise, then they'll sign everything, all the documents. You receive all those documents. Then the seller solicitor will also send their documents. We will then exchange documents to say, okay, we've both got set of contracts, and then we'll call up the other side and say, can we now set a date to exchange contracts? So we might usually say, okay, such and such date, we'll at this time phone each other, go through the contract and exchange.
So that's it, we've bought it?
Not quite, Andrew. Not
Oh,
quite. So on
Bushra.
exchange, beforehand, we'll also then set a date to complete. So unless you're going to exchange and complete on the same day, brilliant. But your exchange might be today, for example, but your completion might be in 2 weeks' time, might be next week, might be several weeks ahead. So in that period of time, you can relax a little bit, but at the same time, you've got to make sure we get your mortgage monies in plenty of time, because I've had instances where mortgage monies come at the 11th hour and you're just worried to bits because you're just worried that you're not going to meet completion deadline. And obviously, just like in the auction scenario, as a buyer, I want to make sure I've sent all the necessary forms and documents to prove to the lender that their interest has been covered. Then they will release monies to my solicitor's client account to say, yes, you're happy, you're good to go. But if I get it a little bit late, then it's going to affect my transaction to be able to send those monies to the seller solicitor's account. So if all goes well, I can send those monies on completion day.
So it's actually, there's a lot of work involved just to get to completion, isn't there? And the delay between exchange and completion is not because your solicitor wants to put the feet up, get their hair done, have the nails done. It's to do with liaising with the lender to make sure that all the funds are going to arrive on time, and not just the lender's funds, but a top tip, get your funds to the solicitor early, because you've got to pay your deposit monies to the solicitor in good time as well.
Correct.
So that's the end of the process, isn't it? Don't you just hang up your boots at completion?
Almost. I would say that is probably 80–85%. You're almost there. You're almost home dry.
Because
there's a little bit more
never
work
communicates with me after that. They always just put their feet up, and I never hear from them.
So Andrew, once I've then completed the purchase for the client, I will get a raft of documents from the seller solicitors, or the title documents that I would not have received the originals of as well, and their side of the contract as well. Once I've got all these piles of documents, I will then double check all the forms, 100% approve everything, and then I will then make an application to the land registry. At the same time, I have to then do the submission for the SDLT, the stamp duty, HMRC payment as well. So those two are high priorities. So I'll have an assistant or another person working with me to make sure that we get it speedily sent off. So those two documents have to be sent, not only just the documents, the forms, the payments, all have to go out, and then we can relax a little bit. But the main thing is, once the land registry gets all their documents, it might be weeks. I mean, currently right now it's months, but if we get any requisitions back from the land registry because they might have identified some sort of discrepancy or error, then we might have to go back to the other side to say, can you confirm whether this charge has been rectified, or this charge has been going to be removed, because we want to make sure that the seller's solicitors have also given us all the right documents to remove the seller's name, the seller's charges as well. So they're usually quite minor points, nothing too complicated, but just in case that comes up, we can quickly rectify it within a day or two, and then speed it up. And then the land registry will actually send you the new office copy entries back, and any original documents that you want to send back to your client to keep. And then you've actually done your transaction.
Then you've done the transaction. So it's not all down to the fact that this is 2021. We're in lockdown 3.0 at the moment. It's not down to the solicitor working from home, homeschooling their children and not bothering with the transaction. It's down to the fact there's an awful lot of third parties involved. And there's things that you can do to actually speed this up yourself via the top tips that we've been sharing as we've gone along. Well, Is there anything that really frustrates you and you think, if clients could do this, it would make my job so much
Yes.
easier and the transaction so much faster?
I think it'd be very similar to the tip I probably gave for the auction purchases. Is just to get little things like your AML documents ready in a folder, maybe on your PC, and send them out as soon as possible. Money's on account, and then even something like searches we can apply for quickly because they can take up time. So if we can get the ball rolling on that point, that'll save you a little bit more time. And then just give me as much information as possible from the outset. Is there somebody else involved, for example, an architect that I'm relying on plans to be drafted as well, which might delay the process as well, because you might be buying an additional piece of land which has to have an ordnance survey map, which is a whole new map that has to be land registry compliant, that I've got to also wait for the seller solicitors to approve, come back to me, or my clients to approve. So all these extra little nuances that I might not have been aware, I need to be informed as soon as possible so that I can act in your best interest.
That is brilliant. Bushra, once again, you have been phenomenal as our in-house or resident Great Property Meet solicitor. I love having these chats with you. I know I give you a hard time sometimes, and I come up with curveballs that you're not necessarily aware of. But Bushra, thank you very much once again for joining us. It's goodbye from me. I'm Andrew Roberts. Don't forget, give Bushra a big thumbs up, hit share, hit subscribe if you haven't, because you'll find out what Bushra's next video is, which I know and Bushra is about to find out. Stay tuned. Thank you very much, Bushra Mohammed.
My pleasure, Andrew.
Below.
Take care. Thank you, Andrew.